Cuba announcement and what it means for U.S. Cuba policy. Welcome. We're glad you're able to join us. I want to let you know, well, first, I'm Natasha Lisota Banan. I'm with the Alliance for Cuba Engagement and Respect, also known as ACERE, A-C-E-R-E. You may see those initials also included in the chat function. We are honored to be able to bring you this conversation today. ACERE is a coalition of organizations throughout the United States that supports I think I'm reading myself. ACERE is an organization of coalitions throughout the United States, dozens of organizations that supported anti-sanctions policies and really promote a path towards respect, mutual engagement, re-engagement with our neighbor to the south, Cuba, and a lifting of the cruel economic embargo. And we're honored to have this conversation with a great group of panelists today to help us analyze and parse out the recent announcement by the Biden administration a couple of weeks ago regarding new measures that the administration will be taking with respect to U.S. Cuba policy. I want to mention for those interested in asking questions of our panelists or have comments that the Q&A function on the bottom of your screen is available to you. The chat is not, but you will see links posted in the chat that you'll be able to access additional resources or any references being made by our panelists, perhaps to resources there, you'll be able to access them. But please feel free to ask all of your questions in the Q&A button, and we'll be sure to make sure that we get those to the panelists at the end of the conversation, just so you have a sense for how this conversation will be flowing. We will begin with directed questions of each panelist, who will have an opportunity to speak to their area of expertise in addressing aspects of the Biden announcement that specifically either go to that area of expertise or affect them personally or affect their families or communities personally. We'll have a facilitated conversation after that, and you'll have a chance to ask questions for anything that may be unclear or that wasn't addressed. Today's session really is designed to help us parse out a little bit what the impact or potential non-impact of the recent announcement is going to have on the lives of Cubans, Cuban Americans, and US residents and citizens. The announcement was made 2 weeks ago on May 16th. And as I mentioned, announced a new series of measures that the administration intends to undertake with respect to the economic and humanitarian situation in Cuba. What remains to be seen, and what we're going to talk about today, is how that will translate to either policy changes, regulatory changes, and in concrete terms, any actual improvement or enhancements in the lives of Cubans in Cuba, and also Cuban Americans in the United States. So thank you for joining us. I want to introduce briefly our panelists, that you know who's going to be in conversation with you today and who they are, and then we'll jump into our questions for them. So first, we have Fulton Armstrong, who is joining us, who's a professor at American University. He's a former staff member at the U.S. Interest section in Havana prior to becoming an embassy. He was also a senior analyst with the CIA, a national intelligence officer for Latin America, and a National Security Council staffer who was responsible and had oversight over issues related to Cuba. He has served for almost 30 years in a number of US government positions and senior staff positions as well, and worked for the Senate Foreign Relations Committee from 2008 to 2011. So brings tremendous expertise to this issue, and we're glad to have Fulton with us today. We also have Carlos Lasso, who's joining us from Puentes de Amor. He's the founder and director of Puentes de Amor, which is an organization based out of Seattle, where he is a teacher and is joining us from. that really advocates to remove and knock down barriers between people in Cuba and people in the United States, irrespective of nationality and citizenship, and is Puentes de Amor means bridges of love, and is seeking to establish that kind of deep connection and relationship between those who are in the US and those who are in Cuba, and to remove any of the tension and barriers that have historically existed and prevented closer relations from happening. He also has, through Puentes de Amor, has helped lead a movement of car caravans that also advocate for closer, amicable, mutually respectful relations between Cuba and the United States. And these caravans take place in cities all across the country. And he'll be speaking to us a little bit more about that as well. And lastly, joining us from Havana, Cuba, is Adriana Heredia, who's the founder of Beyond Roots, an Airbnb experience that shares Afro-Cuban culture and seeks to work with and educate visitors from abroad about Afro-Cuban culture specifically. She is also an economics professor at the University of Havana and the coordinator of In Cuba, which is an innovation incubator. And with Beyond Roots, she organizes community workshops on the Afro aesthetic and designs and sells Afro-Cuban products from her storefront in Havana Vieja and Old Havana. And we're fortunate that she's able to join us from Havana today. So welcome to all of our panelists. I want to mention right before we get started and jump in that some of your offices may have seen recently circulating a Dear Colleague email related to a letter being sponsored by Representatives Presley and Cohen regarding global equity, vaccine equity. And it's a letter to President Biden that highlights Cuba's own vaccines and their commitment to producing and distributing hundreds of million vaccines for under-vaccinated regions of the world. The letter is a call to the administration to review its policies that may prohibit or inhibit Cuba's ability to do so, and to really enhance global cooperation around vaccine access. We've seen in the United States recent outbreaks around COVID yet again, and this is in a highly vaccinated country, as is Cuba. And so we want to encourage your offices to sign on to that letter. The deadline has been extended until next Friday, June 10th, and we'll be circulating links in the chat as well, where you'll be able to find more information about that, or to reach out if you have any questions specifically to your colleagues in the offices of Representatives Presley and Cohen. So let's get started. And I'm going to start with Fulton. So we want to ground this announcement in a larger context of what has been U.S. Cuba policy. While the measures don't necessarily speak to policy changes, they could translate to that. And to help us understand how we should interpret this announcement and what its implications mean, could you speak to its significance politically, geopolitically, how we should be thinking about it and understanding it, and if we should even be comparing it perhaps to the announcement made by the Obama-Biden administration in December of 2014 that we know led to a transformative shift in bilateral relations with Cuba?
Thanks very much. Delighted to be here. Thanks to Aseri and for inviting me to share my analysis with everybody on the May 16 measures. To answer your question, in Spanish, there's a really cool phrase, a saying that is, al buen hambre no hay pan duro, that to great hunger, there's no bread too hard, that even stale crumbs are better than nothing. And I think that might be one way of framing what's been going on. This is not a major policy shift, and it certainly isn't something of monumental importance, such as the December 17, 2014 announcement of a resumption of bilateral relations. Yes, the Biden measures are a step in the right direction. I have to say that, and I'll repeat it several times during my comments. But looking at the context and implementation, about which I'm very aware because I worked on Cuba for 4 years under Bill Clinton, and we did similar measures, astoundingly similar measures 23 years ago to what they're now announcing with such pomp and circumstance. Yes, they're a step in the right direction, but it's quite clear when you look at the broader perspective of things that, as some have said, that it's not a return of the Obama-Biden normalization. It is not a reset of the bilateral relationship. It is not a sign of renewed engagement, frankly, because the measures were unilateral. There was some contact on migration issues, but this deal was unilaterally developed and unilaterally announced. And it's also quite clear that this was not the result of a serious 16-month interagency policy review that the administration has been touting for the last 16 months. I was involved in policy reviews when I was in the White House and at the State Department, and I can tell you that this wasn't what you would call a policy review. It was some tinkering, basically trying to square a circle on promises that were made during the campaign, which were very limited, actually, and then fulfilling them. So they deserve credit, as I said, steps in the right direction. But the purposes also you have to look at, they're pretty tactical and they're pretty political. They're not very strategic, and while consistent with US national interest in their modest way, they're only secondarily focused on the national interest. The administration's sole reason for that they've given publicly is dealing with the surge in migration, both seaborne in the Florida Strait and across the Mexican border, which is a political headache for which the US policy shares a great deal of blame, but they're not addressing the US policies that have contributed to the migration problem as well. And the family reunification measures also, unfortunately, have a very strong political component. They directly respond to an agenda by particular members of Congress who introduced legislation. Wasserman Schultz introduced some, Diaz-Balart did some back in March and April, this legislation, even though those two individuals stridently oppose normalization process. And so they're basically cherry picking what certain members of Congress have been doing on the issue, but trying to make it look like it's a whole lot more. In broader terms, the facts show that the administration is maintaining the objectives of the Trump-Biden policies, which are essentially regime change. And the main elements of the maximum pressure strategies made famous during the Trump administration remain in place. Those are about 243 measures that Trump put in place, and only a few of them have been touched. But they're significant. Let me repeat, I look at my talking points here, steps in the right direction, but let's be honest, there are still 230, 240 something measures in place. The administration has not suspended Title III enforcement. That's Title III of the Helms-Burton Act, which has tied up a lot of the relationship in court and threatens a lot of, including private entrepreneurial type activities in Cuba, and which Trump did. That those Title III enforcements had been suspended by Clinton, Bush, Cheney, and by Obama, of course, but they still remain firmly in place. The administration continues its strong political support and $20 million a year support for democracy promotion programs to foment political change. They are essentially covert actions that are intended to achieve regime change. They continue the $28.1 million a year for radio and TV Marti. They continue to keep the State Department, to keep Cuba on the State Department's list of state sponsors of terrorism, which the Trump people put it back on the list for no reason whatsoever in the closing days of the administration. And having worked many years in the intelligence world, I know that if something's put on a list for reasons other than intelligence, then they could be taken off the list for reasons other than intelligence as well. But the Biden people don't want to touch that as well. The State Department and the administration remain unwilling to admit that their accusations that Cuba conducted sonic attacks against US government employees around the world were false. And again, these are steps in the right direction, but no, the vast majority of measures that have the greatest impact on the Cuban people remain firmly in place. Let's look for a couple of minutes at the specific measures. The remittances, all of which are good. They're all steps in the right direction, and you don't want to look a gift horse in the teeth. But the remittances is a big one because a lot of Cubans are dependent upon the remittances. And instead of getting $11 a day now, as they did under Trump, there is a lift of the cap. That no longer is there a $1,000 per quarter cap on remittances. And the Biden administration says that they're going to allow donative contributions, remittances to support private sector people with a political purpose. And it's a pretty blatantly stated political purpose. It's to drive change on the island. But it's good. It's money in the hands of people who need it. The bigger, and expand entrepreneur access to microfinance. All of these are good, but there's no details on how, because there are policies that remain in place that make it impossible to do remittances, for example, through Western Union, which the Trump administration closed, and the Biden people do not, 400 offices around the island. The Biden people do not intend to allow those offices, they say, to reopen. Instead, they're looking at electronic processors, including one company that led the charge against the Western Union offices, apparently. Again, this is not a very transparent process. We don't have a lot of super detailed information on it. The administration also hasn't abandoned its goal of ensuring that no one that it doesn't like, particularly in the Cuban armed forces, touches the money. But these are good steps, but we need facts, we need details, we need to know how the implementation is going to work. On migration, I referred to it as a political problem. It is really very bad. You have thousands of them showing up, of Cubans showing up on the Mexican border, et cetera. And it is really to the administration's credit that they finally, 16 months into the administration, resumed bilateral consultations with the Cubans, but they haven't yet committed to restore the migration accords that Trump suspended in 2017. It's good that they're now going to resume the Cuban Family Parole Program, CFRP, which is really a nice thing to unify families that are divided. And it traditionally represents several thousand, but somebody at the State Department is telling the media that there are up to 20,000 people in the queue under this particularly very narrow category. So maybe we will meet our 20,000 a year commitment. This is a commitment that began during President Ronald Reagan's term in 1984, after the migration crisis in 1980, called the Mariel crisis, was reaffirmed in 1994 during Clinton, and again in 1995, was kept in place in its entirety by the Bush-Cheney administration, et cetera. But we still haven't made this the real exchange, the real cooperation that we traditionally have done. The State Department says that they will partially restaff the consulate. There's no sign yet of new people applying for visas and arriving, but we have to trust them, but we will try to verify. And that there will be limited staffing there. And every other visa category, according to their own public statements, beyond this limited family category, they'll have to go to Guyana, Georgetown, Guyana, to apply for their visas, which is an incredible burden on them financially, or their families up here that are sponsoring their travel. So there's still a lot of obstacles in place to normal migration stuff, but this is good. The bigger problem is that they're not addressing the underlying drivers of migration, of which the US embargo and the 200-something Trump measures are indeed a factor, a key factor, in fact. On support to independent entrepreneurs, this is such a good idea that we did it 23 years ago during the Clinton administration, but perhaps with fewer strings attached. It's really good. They're going to encourage cloud technology, which didn't exist during Clinton. Or cloud technology, these terms didn't exist in 1999. But the devil in details is in the details with this. Is this going to be part of the democracy promotion programs that USAID, NED, NDI, IRI are doing? Or is this going to be a real non-governmental people-to-people sort of thing? Or is it just going to be another covert operation that is run by agencies that are not entirely transparent, to tell you the truth? When I was on the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, we did investigations, and we consistently hit more brick walls than we had when we were looking at intel community sorts of activities. There are also the same problems with remittances, the logistical problems what channels are you going to send people the money in? There are much better solutions, and that is to hand things over to the American people and let Americans do it rather than the American government. The last category is the expanded authorized travel one, another good idea. flights to non-Havana destinations was, as were other measures, such a good idea that we did it 23 years ago during Clinton. We called it multi-destination because it is a real burden on families to travel across the island to get to the Havana airport to fly up and pay for an outrageously priced charter flight up to the United States. So it is a great idea to do multi-destination. Kudos for that. For people-to-people travel, it still seems like there are a lot of political criteria for it. And there's one major problem. One major problem is that it has to be groups. Individuals can't do it. But the problem related to that is you can't stay in a government-owned hotel. That's a Trump measure that still stays in place. And I know that Airbnbs are really cool. I've stayed in Airbnbs in Havana, as I have in hotels, not in violation of the Trump rules, of course. But I'm not sure if Airbnbs can accommodate large travel groups of people that are going down to do people-to-people relations. It's also unclear whether groups will be traveling on what we call a general license, that any group can form itself and go, or whether it has to be a specific license that they go and honor at the altar of the Office of Foreign Assets Control, which then consults with the State Department and the Commerce Department and gives them a license. It's just not clear yet. We have to wait for the regulations to come out. So bottom line is people who think that US policy should be based on the national interest, and people who think that normalization, the Obama and former Biden, the previous Biden normalization process was consistent with the national interest, could defensively say these measures are just stale crumbs. They could also be politically a little bit concerned because it looks like the administration has calculated that progressive people have nowhere else to go and are going to be satisfied with these crumbs. And I think that if you read even what progressive-minded analysts have been writing, the administration probably feels pretty good about itself because they're getting huge amounts of praise for these minimalist steps. And so it looks like this might be it. I'd hope that it wouldn't be this way, but analytically speaking, it looks like these good steps will be all that we're going to be getting for quite some time. One last point, because it is politically driven, and that is that the administration's efforts to blame Cuban Americans for these minimalist steps, the minimalistness of these steps, I think is a little bit unfair because it ignores the fact that Cuban Americans have embraced people-to-people measures for a long time, since they were first done during the Clinton administration, and while they were continued during the Bush-Cheney administration, and of course, completely expanded under Obama. The Cuban American community did not oppose those sorts of things. And they embraced a bunch of other people-to-people measures as well, including support to what back then were called cuentapropistas and now is legitimately called the private sector. And it is true that Cuban Americans will support sound policies again. The mandate that I think the administration should know that it has is when they provide, or if they provide leadership, this community that they like to put in a little corner, almost as a stereotype, this community will follow. Good first steps we see so far, but we still need leadership to move forward. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Fulton. You really helped us unpack and contextualize these measures in both the historical context, and also you left us with a lot of questions about what this really actually is going to translate to. And I'm hoping that our next two speakers can maybe delve into that a little bit more. To your last point, I'm sure Carlos Lazo has some thoughts about what the Cuban American community feels and thinks about these measures. But before we get to that, I want to introduce our next speaker, and hopefully she can pick up on where you left us off with around some of the measures that are designed to benefit Cuban entrepreneurs. There's a specific measure that was announced that the US government says that it will be authorizing expanded access to different types of technological platforms, to microfinancing options for Cuban entrepreneurs, that they intend to work with Cuban entrepreneurs much more kind of expansively and aggressively. We don't necessarily know what that translates to just yet, but Adriana, as a Cuban entrepreneur herself and as part of an incubator initiative, we're hoping that you can help us think through what this will look like and translate to in terms of concrete changes in the lives of people like you. So as a Cuban entrepreneur, Adriana, first, what is your reaction to the announcement? And how do you respond to the presumption that's been circulating recently that in fact there is no entrepreneurial sector in Cuba? And if I can even throw in another question there, how does existing U.S. policy actually hurt Cuban entrepreneurs, and how do you see this announcement in light of that?
Okay, first of all, I'm really grateful for the invitation, and I was really looking forward to share my experience as a Cuban entrepreneur. First of all, I would love to say that nowadays, I am a business owner, and that was possible due to the restrictions that were lifted out during Obama's administration. So I saw a potential in the touristic activity since I realized that there were a lot of people coming to Cuba, mainly from the US. And in that context, I had the opportunity to see myself for first time in my entire life as an entrepreneur and as a business owner. So I wanted to start with that for you to see and understand how important was that period for me and my family and the people that surround me. With the new announcements, I have to say that I saw the light at the end of the tunnel. And even though not anything is like established yet, at least we see an intention. And I said that we see because actually I remember that I found out about the news because I was seeing all these notifications in the different WhatsApp groups where there are a lot of different entrepreneurs. So we entrepreneurs in Cuba, we communicate through different WhatsApp groups. And I was like, what's going on? A lot of notifications at the same time. And it was because of the new. Everyone was sharing, everyone was celebrating. And we all were feeling in the same mood. It's like finally some intention. I also was thinking that this was very important here. I am not only as Adriana, I am also representing the entrepreneurial community in Cuba. I have to say, first of all, that the US market is not only a big market for us, but also is a closer market. So the first thing that was affecting us a lot was the restrictions regarding to the tourist activity. Many businesses in Cuba were relying on that activities. And it's important that you understand that it's not only the business related to the tourism, the ones that were getting benefits from it. When my business was growing, I was actually able to employ more people that were able to get more money, that at the same time were able to support other businesses that were not related with the tourist activity. So it's a chain, and you need to understand the Cuba economy as a system. So something like could see or be seen as a measure that benefits some of the business actually is benefit different kind of businesses in Cuba. As a second thing, I want to establish that getting access to US is more important than never right now here in Cuba. Not only because we need to get the supplies for living, like goods and services for living, but also because we business owners, we need to import, and not all the businesses have the opportunity to export to get US dollars or euros. So for you to have an idea, something very basic, since the announcement was made, the US dollar in the black market, as we call it here in Cuba, went down from 125 Cuban pesos to 95 Cuban pesos. Only one announcement. So imagine what could mean for us entrepreneurs that don't have access to that currency, that finally tourists can come to the island, or that remittances are allowed in bigger amounts, okay, for the development of our businesses. So that was a second restriction that we were facing. And actually, we think that with the new announcement, that could be at least solved in some way. The third element is the possibility to process financial transactions. For instance, me, I have an experience on Airbnb, not only one, actually, at the end of 2019, we were having 6 different experiences on Airbnb. We were having contracts with more than 20 different entrepreneurs. We were able to receive around 300 guests every single month. And we were a team of 36 different persons working behind that. So actually, we were able to create around the tourist activity and a whole ecosystem. And imagine not having a financial mechanism to be able to process the transactions between the US and Cuba. And that was limiting a lot, because every time you charge for services and so on, and you try to look for an alternative way, because yes, we are entrepreneurs, we are all the time thinking outside of the box, but all the time you are unsecure, you are afraid, because at the moment PayPal, for instance, identify that you are trying to operate from Cuba, they can froze the transaction. And for an entrepreneur that is starting, every cent counts, okay, and it hurts. So that was another important thing, and we really look forward that change in the future. The third thing is to be able to use apps, or to be able to integrate to the e-commerce system that US provide. There are a lot of different technological tools that are designed in the US, and that made entrepreneurs' life super easier. And it's very hard for us to know about that tools, to try to get access to those tools, and then the typical sign that say, no, you can't access because you are from Cuba. So that happens to us every time. We want to be competitive, we want to grow, we are trying to make the difference, we want to generate value for the Cuban society, not only for us, we also want to help people that surround us, okay? And to show that, yes, there are a lot of things to do here, and that we are eager to grow, but then you face those barriers that made you sad. Something so basic like using Shopify, for instance. I have a huge community that support my business in the US. Imagine receiving 300 guests every month for 3 years. So how many people are not related with the values, with yes, the values that we promote in Beyond Roots, and they all the time want to support, and they would love to have some of the designs we have in Cuba there in the US. And there are a lot of easy tools that I could use. Like, okay, I could use Printful, and then use Shopify, and like this, I could charge and I could sell my t-shirts not only in the US, but also in the rest of the world. Easy piece of cake, but no, because I am from Cuba, and that's not possible. So that's something that we really aim to change. The other thing is the possibility not only to receive bigger amounts of remittances, but also to receive microcredits from the US. Of course, that's possible, because our businesses are also pointing to that market. So it could be very easy to establish business with other people that make businesses in the US, or to receive some benefits of credits and so on. And the other important thing is to have the ability of traveling, to getting a visa, not only because we want to establish commercial relationships with other business owners in the United States, but also for something basic, training. In Cuba, now the private sector is pretty new, okay? We are learning how to do it. I study economics, I come from the economics faculty, and I have to tell you that I was not receiving any training to be an entrepreneur. So right now I'm lost. I'm trying to go to online courses. I'm trying to study a lot. I wake up every day at 5 a.m. to study, to prepare myself to be an entrepreneur. But it's not only about knowledge, technical knowledge, it's about the culture. And you get that culture visiting other businesses similar to your business, okay? And seeing how other people do it. So the ability of establishing some kind of connection between entrepreneurs in the US and Cuban entrepreneurs to have the possibility of traveling there to learn, to be part of an incubation program, an acceleration program, for instance, would be awesome. And today, we don't have that opportunity. I am a lucky person. I was able to be in the United States in 2019. Actually, I even went to the Congress and explained the situation as a Cuban entrepreneur. And that was a headache. I had to travel to Trinidad and Tobago to get the visa, spend money to go there, stay in Trinidad and Tobago, far away from my family, from my business for 7 days. To go to my interview, they didn't review the papers I was presenting, and they denied without looking me at the eyes. They were like, no, you are not approved, you are young. In that time, I was not married, and no, you are possible migrant, so you are denied. So it means Adriana spent a lot of money, 7 days of her life in another country to just receive no answer. At the end, I was able to travel because as an entrepreneur, you think outside of the box and you keep trying. But it's about making things easier, not hardest. So basically, that's a review from an entrepreneur point of view. At least with the intention, we are prepared, we are trained to be optimistic by nature. And at least I dream today with, okay, we could have at least what we used to have when I started with Beyond Roots in 2016. But just let you know that we want more. And if the intention is supporting Cuban people, I think that they need to start paying attention on what people in Cuba say, okay? I am not agree with people making politics without listening to the ones that are gonna be benefits by the policy. So this kind of exchange are the ones that make the difference, okay? Because you need to understand from us what is our situation in order to design the policies and just took the best decisions, I think.
Wow, thank you, Adriana. I think you lifted up so many important aspects because when we are thinking of these new measures being announced, of the 4 measures, there's one and it says Cuban entrepreneurs. But what you surface really is that it isn't just access to Zoom or maybe PayPal that's going to make the life of a Cuban entrepreneur better and more prosperous and for their families. One, you recognize that you're an integral part of the Cuban economic model. And also that, it's inherent and really incumbent to have a public that you can market your products to, which means where's the tourism at? And we often think about the restrictions on the travel of US citizens and residents, right, as a imposition on our freedom to travel. But the fact is that that's actually a mechanism that also supports Cuban entrepreneurs and private economic activity in Cuba, having more tourism, having more people being able to go interact and exchange those kinds of exchanges that you were talking about, being exposed to other ideas and other businesses, and always thinking creatively, but also the economic burden that exists when you're trying to think about ways to promote your product and your services and have to bear really high economic cost to access visas, to access the ability to travel yourself. And without full consular services available to you and having to go to a third country, those aren't necessary measures we think of in terms of supporting Cuban entrepreneurial activity, but really are critical, as you pointed out. Thank you for that. And you also brought up the notion of remittances, and I want to bring in our last panelist here, Carlos Lasso, the founder of Puentes de Amor. The measures include 2 aspects in particular that really speak to supporting Cuban families. And one of those is remittances, and not just family remittances, but donative remittances for businesses, possibly precisely like Adriana's, for example, if you're not a family member of hers, but also the reestablishment of the Cuban Family Reunification Act. And before we turn to Carlos, there's a video that may help us frame this issue and provide a little bit of historical context that I want to share from Belly and the Beast. So we can start with that small clip first, and then we can jump into asking questions with Carlos.
In Cuba these days, there are lines for pretty much everything.
Aquí no. There are more than 400 Western Union payment points across Cuba, y todos están cerrados.
Money transfers to friends and family, called remittances, are a huge part of the Cuban economy. 56% of Cubans polled in a recent survey said they received remittances. This is not unique to Cuba. People across the global south receive remittances from friends and family who have migrated to the United States and other wealthy countries. Cubans used to receive an estimated $3 billion a year in remittances, mostly from the United States. In October 2020, Donald Trump blocked U.S. remittance companies like Western Union from working with FinCimex, the state-owned Cuban company that processed the transfers. The Biden campaign accused Trump of waging a war on family remittances. But after becoming president, Biden flip-flopped.
I would not do that now because the fact is it's highly likely that the regime would confiscate those remittances or big chunks of it.
This is both inaccurate and misleading. Since July 11, Biden seems to be taking his cues from Cuban American hardliners.
I want to be able to send my aunt in Cuba money, but the regime takes 20% off the top of every dollar I send.
This is false. In 2020, Western Union charged a $7 fee to send a $200 remittance to Cuba. Western Union kept $5.50 and gave the remaining $1.50 to FinCimex. These fees are normal for the region and even lower than some countries.
Well, of course, there's not an amount that is acceptable to us to go into the coffers of the Cuban government.
You can still get money from family and friends in the US, but it takes longer y cuesta mucho más dinero.
Hi, Natalie.
Hey Liz, I'm here at U.S Cuba. I'm gonna go turn in the $100. I'm here in Little Havana, Miami.
U.S Cuba is a company in Miami that offers money transfers to Cuba.
4,000 pesos cubanos.
So here is the receipt. You should be getting it in 24 to 72 hours.
U.S Cuba delivers the money directly to your house, bypassing FinCimex. Before the ban on FinCimex, I would have gotten the equivalent of around $100 via Western Union. Here's what I got via U.S Cuba: 4,000 Cuban pesos. That's about $65. Biden is opposed to the Cuban government earning a 1% fee on money transfers, pero parece no molestarle con que las empresas en Miami cobren un 40%.
So a little bit of context now for our conversation with Carlos Lazo. Carlos, if you're there. Carlos, as I mentioned, represents Puentes de Amor. And so the measures spoke about removing the cap, the $1,000 cap on family remittances, allowing donative remittances, and also reestablishing the family reunification program. And so I want to ask, as a Cuban American, as the founder of an organization that represents Cuban Americans across the United States, what is your reaction to the recent announcement by the administration regarding these measures? And do you think that the Cuban American community overall supports them?
Well, my reaction was happiness because it's a step in the right direction. For many months, Cuban Americans have been asking the first Trump administration, then later Biden administration, to allow us to send remittances through a safe and cost-effective way. And during the pandemic, Trump imposed these measures about the remittances, and it was really hurtful for the Cuban American families and for the families in Cuba, not being allowed to send money through their families, especially during those tough times. I think that the majority of the Cuban American community in the United States and also around the world, because these restrictions don't just affect Cubans in the United States. They were imposed in Western Union across the world, and Western Union cannot send money to Cuba from different countries. Then the reaction from people in general was positive that we can send money. Now let's wait to see when that is going to be implemented, because it has been the case that during this administration that they announce something, but the implementation takes a long time. What is the next question, Natasha?
Well, have you heard any feedback from the broader Cuban American community about these? I mean, we often hear that announcements out of the multiple administrations are really designed to appease a sector of the Cuban American community, as though it was monolithic, as though it only had, one perspective or thought. And yet we have also seen historically how so many actually support these types of measures. So, have you heard, and what is the sense that there's been, has this generated encouragement, support? Have there been demands for more from the administration?
Yes.
What would you like to see?
Well, first of all, and I would like to go to the support or not support of the Cuban Americans to these policies. In a poll done by FIU in 2020, and that was the last one. I have the data here. It's interesting because 70% of the Cuban Americans think that the blockade, the embargo have no work. At the same time, 60% in this pool of Cuban Americans support the continuation of the blockade. But when you put this in context, what people support in specific measures, 57% support the suspension of the blockade or embargo during the pandemic. 66% support to send and allow Cuba to buy food in the United States. 71% support allowing Cuba to buy medications in the United States without any license. 66% support that the United States support the civil society in Cuba, basically supporting the people who have business, doing everything possible to help those people. More than 50% support the relationship between the two countries. 66% support sending remittances. And I mean, like in general, when you put this topic by topic and not just a specific question about the blockade or embargo, most people in the Cuban American community support the lifting of the sanctions. We had a petition like a year ago to the then candidate Biden, asking Biden to do specifically what he did now, or what he announced that he will do. Reopening the embassy in Havana, allowing sending remittances to Cuba, reopening the airports in province for American airlines, and also allowing Americans to visit Cuba, reunification program. That's what basically was in our petition, and that's what had been announced that is going to be implemented. And we see as a positive case. We don't have a pool, but during the last 23 months in Miami, in different parts of the United States, but specifically in Miami, we have done growing a movement of caravans of people going and protesting and showing the desire for a better relationship between Cuba and the United States and for the lifting of the sanctions. And you see a growing movement of people going to those caravans every end of the month. On the other side, people who usually and traditionally have been opposed to this are less and less. And we really think that this is a moment for the administration to move forward. Yes, this is a right step in the right direction, but these policies have not worked for 60 years, and not just because they are not practical, they don't make sense, but at the same time, they are unhuman on the Cuban people, on the Cubans in the United States, on the Cubans in the island. And the best approach should be creating bridges of love between our two countries, the same way that President Obama did during his administration. And that has the support, even when the most vocal part of the Cuban community express opposition to this. When you go to the streets of Miami, you can see the people asking for this. And the people, when we go in the streets, the people asking, please lift the sanctions, lift the blockade. It's no longer about little sanctions to relieve some families, because this is the blockade is something that affects Cuba generally, the Cuban economy. And when Cuba cannot sell the products in the United States, Cuba cannot get money for the healthcare system, for different things, for education. When we have to ask for a special license for a special medication, who has the right to extend a license for the right to life, for the right to live of Cuban kids? I want to show you a little video of how this movement have been growing and how more and more Cuban Americans show their support to the lifting of the blockade to Cuba. Let me put it here.
Ahí mirando cocina todos esos carros.
¡Arriba, caballero! ¡Dale! A esta gente no nos para nadie. Mira, profe, fuentes de amor. La familia. Hacemos esto. Caballero, esto está súper emocionante, de verdad. Profe, necesitamos que la gente firme, solamente nosotros necesitan firmar esa petición, caballero. Ya se firmaron la petición de Puentes de Amor. ¡Ay, qué bonito!
So Carlos, this was the caravan from this past weekend, correct?
No. The past weekend was bigger than this one. This was
Okay.
still Biden was candidate. This has been for 23 months in a row. We have been doing this, and it's getting bigger and bigger. More people are incorporating, more people are coming. And the other side, what we call the haters, ask for thousands to come and protest against us, and just 30 people, and less than what we have there. I mean, the majority of the people that was present here, they support. See, this is in the streets of Miami, and this happened months after month. And they were able to sign a petition, 28,000 signatures that were delivered to the White House, asking precisely this, to lift the sanctions.
That was an important comment that you just made. If you want to take off the video, because I want people to hear the numbers that you just mentioned.
Los demás una muerte gloriosa, que
See, it was raining, okay? It was, and this is incredible, you know, even raining, no matter what, people are just showing the support of the lifting of the sanctions. And we want to bring this support and educate communities, not just in Miami, or because it is a topic that affects all Americans. And we encourage the Biden administration to do anything to restore good relationship with Cuba, as not just as a neighbor, but as a friend, and to create bridges of love between our two countries.
Thank you. Those images were really powerful, Carlos, and I think often go missed in the larger conversation around U.S. Policy towards Cuba, or the presumption of whom is being made on behalf of. But what we saw there were families, were children, were U.S. flags, Cuban flags, was really a long, long line of people demanding a different kind of policy and relationship. And for them to be able to actually help their families, when we think of these new measures, it isn't just remittances or increasing perhaps the number of visas allowed, or not requiring everyone to have to go to a third country to solicit a visa, even though that remains the majority of those who are going to be looking for visas in Cuba. It really means lifting the full embargo, which is what you were talking about.
I also want to make a little point. Right now, see the extension of how the blockade affect the Cuban people. Right now, there are 8 Cuban kids who need liver transplant. And because the medication for doing the transplant to preserve the organ need a special license to buy in the United States, we are basically stopped. We are asking the community to do it in any way, but think about this. How is possible that in 2022, the United States have to extend a license to buy certain medical products to Cuba, or to buy certain food? Or, I mean, this should be something just common sense, human. There was not license for that. It should be a general license to buy anything in case embargo stay there. And this is very cruel and is affecting deeply the Cuban people in the middle of a pandemic.
Thank you for mentioning that. I think listening to you, listening to Adriana, really understanding how sanctions policies impact the very tangible, practical lives of Cubans is really important for our audience to understand. And that brings me back to wanting to mention the current vaccine equity letter that's being distributed throughout Congress that we want to encourage your offices to sign on to, precisely for this reason, about medical cooperation, about collaboration when it comes to saving lives. And we know that the vaccine continues to be an integral part of that. So that's being led by Representatives Presley and Cohen's offices. There's a Dear Colleague letter being circulated that is asking the administration to review policies such as the one that Carlos was just talking about, that may impede Cuba's ability to produce and distribute its vaccine at low cost to under-vaccinated nations. Now, I want to bring all of you back on, and we've had several questions in the chat. And given the panorama that you've laid out, the challenges, the questions that continue to remain with us as a result of this announcement, and not sure about what it's going to translate to yet in terms of practical changes and substantive changes, I want to start with you, Fulton. What are the recommendations to congressional offices at this point? And that includes Republican members as well, who at one point were very encouraged and excited and engaged around supporting, for example, the Cuban private sector, and yet we haven't heard much from in the last 5 years or so. What are specific measures that, in addition to these requests of the administration, that congressional offices can and should be looking at and pushing for and asking for, or undertaking themselves, to promote the very humanitarian, human rights, economic changes that the United States has espoused?
Yep, thank you. And I saw the questions in the chat box, excellent questions. What can a legislative office do? I mean, our colleagues on the Hill know better what the initiatives are, what the Dear Colleagues are, what's being drafted, what's being pushed. I see here in the group chat that Leahy joins in introducing the bill to end the embargo. These are the initiatives that hopefully everybody who's had enough interest to sit through our 1 hour with them is tracking or at least distributing information among themselves. So legislation, of course. And dear colleagues, of course, those names, I worked in the House for 4 years and the Senate for 3 years at different times of my career. And I know that it might look abstract to be signing a dear colleague that would only have X number of members out of 435 or 535, but these are really important signals that people care. One of the problems that we have here is that the administration, but whether you're looking at the political side, the NSC, or you're looking at the bureaucratic side, the State Department, think that no one's watching and think that they can basically work their careers and their political agendas without consequence. I can tell you, having worked on the Senate Foreign Relations Committee for 3 years, that they care very much about their careers, and that if they know that there could be consequences for their careers of taking positions or going with the flow or giving an inordinate amount of power to a minority of members, that they will listen to the other side. But if the other side doesn't make a little bit of noise or make a lot of noise, that's important. Second huge thing, so you have legislation, you have dear colleagues, is oversight. You have some really fantastic people that are involved in the House Foreign Affairs Committee, staff and members that collaborate with the committee, even if they're not members. That oversight is really important. And having worked in the Investigations Committee, the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, it is years ago, but the problems today are much worse. I know that a little bit of oversight can go a long way because some of these programs are out and out scandalous. If Congress doesn't do oversight, the media are spread so thin and it's all nuanced and stuff. The media don't get involved. Although on Cuba, remember, it was the Associated Press that broke stories like Sunsuneo and other covert operations that had blown up. This is in the wake of the Alan Gross scandal when he was in jail for 5 years. So oversight and getting oversight then to spread to the media is important. Couple of fundamental things. One, track events and don't believe everything that you read from one side or the other on Cuba. Do some analysis of what happened, for example, last July 11, and how in a way you had very legitimate popular discontent being channeled by people with a political agenda that was not the agenda of the majority of the people who turned out. So follow the events, do some analysis, and if you can't do the analysis because you don't have the time or the experience, call someone who can help walk you through sorts of stuff. And related to that, making noise. There's also a thing, making noise is a political function that supports your allies as well. You might be working in a Democratic office. The administration needs you to be making noises. There are famous stories of LBJ during voting rights turning to the African-American community to say, make some goddamn noise so that I can then say that I'm under pressure from you. Don't just trust me to do stuff. And for us just to trust the Biden administration after 16 months, we can see that they don't have the initiative. You have to make some noise and make them feel that there is a center, because this policy is not even remotely leftist. There is a center to do that. So let the bureaucrats know that you're watching on the ground, promote people to people. Governments, the two governments are so dysfunctional in the bilateral relationship. Let the people do this relationship, unleash them. We have so many good people and they have so many good people. Let them work out some of these problems instead of the US government dictating which private sector person deserves to get a remittance from which organization. Why not just say, let's go back to do true people to people. So that's my quick rundown.
Those are excellent points, and you left the staffers attending with quite an agenda of things to undertake. I also want to point out in the chat, you'll also see numerous legislative initiatives, including bills that were introduced last year that are still current and pending in this legislative session that your offices can sign on to and co-sponsor, co-lead, help build momentum around, including initiatives around trade, around some of the sanctions measures. There's the current Dear Colleague letter going on. I also want to mention that even though we're painting a somewhat dim picture, there was a really unprecedented effort that took place just a few months ago where 114 members of the House signed a letter to President Biden asking specifically for this and more to take place, and basically calling for normalization of relations as occurred under the administration that he was a part of, and that there's really no reason for him to continue the failed policies of Donald Trump when he was part of an administration that produced a transformative change in hemispheric relations. That letter, signed by 114 members, including, I'm sure, some of the offices that are joining us today. We want to thank you for that and hope that you'll join the current letter circulating around vaccine equity. So I want to ask Adriana and then Carlos, from your perspectives, you laid out a lot of what needs to happen, what you want to happen, what you're hoping will happen based on these the measures, promises that are being made. What specifically would you like to ask the Biden administration or members of Congress to do today, if you could, to make your lives a little bit better as Cubans, as Cuban Americans, for yourselves, for your families, for your friends, for your communities? What would you like to ask, and what would you like to see happen now? Adriana, I'll start with you.
Okay. First of all, I would say, like, pay attention and listen to us. That's the first thing I have to ask. The second thing is, like, give us access to technology, access to finance, access to traveling. Some things that gets my attention all the time, and it was very related to what Carlos was saying, is that America is supposed to be the land of freedom. Why are they then restricting our freedom to choose? So all the time I'm thinking that at the moment Biden was elected, I was feeling the elections like I was an American citizen. And in that moment I reflected and I was, why do I have to feel in that way? And it's because US have so much power with is going on here in Cuba that I will be asking that first. Understand our situation, and for that you need to pay attention on what we are saying, and second is, like, give us access. Okay.
And Carlos, what about you?
Well, and we have been asking for many years, and the least, if I have to ask something for the Cuban people, for the American people, let Cuba live. Leave the blockade, leave the embargo. It have no work. It have punished the Cuban people. And if I have to ask for something less extreme, somebody could perceive that as extreme, I just see as human, as common sense, then at least go back to the Obama policies. Restore the Obama policies, the same steps that he started taking, and for sure, it's gonna bring more prosperity to the Cuban society. It's gonna be better for the United States. It's gonna be good for every or most of the people, especially for the people of the United States and Cuba. Restore the Obama policies and move forward and leave the blockade. That's what I will ask.
Thank you. And we are winding down on time now. I want to throw out a last question, which, and maybe Fulton, if you want to start with this. We know that in a week or so, the upcoming Summit of the Americas is going to take place, and that's been a source of deep concern in the region about the exclusion of a number of countries, Cuba included, and discontent being expressed. How do you think that these measures will or will not affect participation in that, or regional or hemispheric relations? And as of now, at least, there are still countries, including Cuba, that have not been invited and who don't look like they'll participate. Do you see the summit as weighing in on any future policy changes or announcement coming out of the administration? And how do you see these measures fitting within them?
I can be really brief. I don't think anybody in Latin America thinks that any of these measures matters at all. They think that the whole thing is the embargo remains in place. The silliness of US measures, lifting a couple of the silly measures for the Latin Americans isn't really persuasive of any signal at all coming from the Biden administration. The thing that could happen at the summit the summit does seem to be headed for a massive train wreck because of the exclusion and because of the administration's inability to negotiate. Instead, they're trying to leverage people, heads of state, to come rather than really negotiate with them. Is you might remember that when President Obama went to the Summit of the Americas in Cartagena, Colombia, in 2017, it was 2018, whenever it was a turning point for U.S. Latin America policy, when he realized that he had been very poorly advised by his staff and by the State Department, that they were focused on a very narrow political agenda, very narrow constituencies. And basically he ran into an ambush in Cartagena, led ironically by a center-right president, President Santos of Colombia, and then strengthened by a whole bunch of others. He came back and he fired some major members of his team, and he asked the State Department to clean up its act a little bit. Maybe that'll happen this time. It's unfortunate that it's necessary to do it, but that was the wake-up call. It still took a couple of years for him to do normalization, but at least he did begin to set the process in motion. So the Summit of the Americas beforehand doesn't matter at all. It obviously hasn't affected anything, but afterward, depending on whether Latin Americans rally or they stick to staying away and send foreign ministers instead of heads of state, it could have some impact.
Thank you for that. I also want to thank our panelists, all of our panelists. If you are part of that group travel that's recently been authorized to go down and you find yourself in Old Havana, visit Beyond Roots, go visit Adriana personally, support Afro-Cuban businesses. If you are in the United States, find a caravan in your city through Puentes de Amor's website and feel free to join them the last Sunday of every month. And for all of our congressional offices joining us, please take a look at the Dear Colleague email and letter that's currently being circulated by Representatives Presley and Cohen. The deadline has recently been extended to next Friday, June 10th. It is a letter promoting global vaccine equity and enhanced collaboration around medical crises such as the pandemic, and allowing Cuba to be able to make its vaccines, plural vaccines, available in severely undervaccinated regions and parts of the world. Thank you to everyone who joined us today. We'll be circulating a recording of this video. And if you have any questions or concerns or want to learn more about U.S. Cuba policy or how we can better support Cuban entrepreneurs, Cuban Americans, please feel free to visit ACERE's website, www.acere.org. Our email will also be available in the chat. That's allianceforcuba@acere.org. And we're happy to support you in any way we can. Thank you to everyone for joining us today. Muchas gracias.